The wind off Holloway Cove was cold enough to make a grown man's eyes water, and Eli Rourke told himself that was the only reason his vision blurred as he stood at the end of the town dock, hands jammed in his coat pockets, staring at a man he had known for exactly 6 weeks and somehow could not imagine his life without. "Say something," Eli said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to, scraped thin by cold air and something else entirely. "Micah, please, say something." Dr. Micah Bennett didn't move. He stood 2 feet away, close enough that Eli could see the fine tremor in his jaw, the way his breath came out in visible clouds and caught, hitched like a man trying to hold a door shut against a storm. Behind him, the lighthouse beam swept across the black water in slow, patient arcs, throwing pale gold light across half his face and then taking it away again. "I don't know how," Micah finally said. "I don't know how to say this without breaking something." "Then break it," Eli said, and the words cracked down the middle of him as he said them. 34 years of careful silence splitting open on a dock in the middle of December. "I already told you the thing I've spent my whole life hiding. I told you I'm gay. I told you I think I'm in love with you. I don't have anything left to lose by breaking things, Micah. Please, just tell me if I'm standing out here alone." The lighthouse beam swept past again. In the gap of darkness that followed, Eli felt Micah's hand find his, fingers cold and certain, closing around his own like it was the most natural gesture in the world, like it belonged to some older, steadier story than the one they'd been telling each other for 6 weeks. "You're not standing out here alone," Micah said. "You never were. That's kind of the whole problem." To understand how 2 of the most guarded men in Holloway Cove had ended up standing at the edge of the harbor in the freezing dark, holding on to each other like the tide might take one of them if they let go, you had to go back. Not far, only 6 weeks, but far enough that neither of them had known the other's name yet, and both of them were still convinced they'd built their walls tall enough to keep anyone out for good. 6 weeks earlier, Eli Rourke had never planned on setting foot in the new doctor's office at all. He was 34 years old, built like the harbor pilots and lobstermen he'd grown up around, with his father's broad shoulders and his mother's quiet eyes, and he had exactly one rule that had kept him alive and functional in Holloway Cove for over a decade. Don't give anyone a reason to look at you too closely. He worked the harbor authority boats, guiding the big commercial vessels through the rocks and shoals that had wrecked ships since before his grandfather's time. He drank coffee at the same diner every morning at the same corner stool, and he nodded at the same 50 faces every day, faces that had known him since he was a boy in oversized rubber boots trailing his father down to the boats. None of those faces knew the truth about who he was, because Eli had built his entire life around the architecture of not being known. It had cost him things. It had cost him, first and worst, for years of near silence with his father, Warren Rourke, after a disastrous winter during Eli's sophomore year of college when a photograph had surfaced. An arm slung around another boy's shoulders at a party, nothing more, nothing that should have mattered, and his father had looked at it the way a man looks at a boat he no longer trusts to hold water. Warren hadn't shouted. That was the part that still woke Eli up some nights, 12 years later. His father hadn't shouted at all. He'd just gone quiet in a different way than usual, a shuttered kind of quiet, and something between them had never fully opened back up, even after the 4 hardest years passed and a kind of brittle normalcy resumed. So Eli had learned to keep his own door shut too. He dated no one in Holloway Cove. When he needed to feel less alone, he drove 2 hours to Portland, where nobody knew his last name, and he came home before anyone would ask where he'd been. There had been a man in Portland once, for the better part of a year, a graphic designer named Theo who wanted things Eli couldn't give him. Dinners in public, a name spoken aloud to friends, a future that didn't require a 2-hour drive to exist. Theo had finally asked him, not unkindly, whether Eli intended to spend his whole life as a roomer in his own hometown, and Eli hadn't had an answer, and that had been the end of it. It wasn't a life so much as a held breath stretched out over years, and Eli had gotten so used to holding it that he'd nearly forgotten breathing was supposed to feel different. The chest pains started in October. Small at first. A tightness after a long shift, a flutter he blamed on too much coffee, and then, one gray Tuesday morning while he was walking a fishing trawler through the Eastern Channel, his heart had slammed into a rhythm so fast and wrong that he'd had to grip the wheelhouse rail to stay upright, certain for one long, cold minute that he was about to die with his secret still folded up inside him like something never mailed. He didn't die. But 2 days later, his hands still not quite steady, he walked into the clinic on Anchor Street, because even a man who has spent his life avoiding scrutiny understands the difference between pride and self-destruction. He did not expect the doctor to be new. He definitely did not expect the doctor to be the kind of man who made Eli's carefully held breath catch in his throat before either of them had said a single word. Dr. Micah Bennett was standing in the small waiting room when Eli walked in, reading something off a clipboard with his glasses pushed up into dark hair that badly needed a trim, wearing a flannel shirt under his white coat like he hadn't quite decided whether he was here to practice medicine or chop wood. He looked up, and there was a beat, just a beat, where his whole face seemed to soften with the particular, unguarded warmth of a man meeting someone new in a town where everyone had known each other forever. "You must be new blood," Micah said, and then winced at himself. "Sorry. That's a terrible thing to say to a man with a cardiac complaint. Micah Bennett. I took over from Dr. Halvorsen in September."
Eli Rourke.
He shook the offered hand, and something about the grip, steady, warm, unhurried, stayed with him longer than a handshake should have. "Rourke," Micah repeated, like he was filing it away. "Harbor family? 3 generations of us out on the water. I break the streak a little, I do the piloting now, not the fishing." Eli surprised himself by offering that much information without being asked twice. He wasn't usually so free with himself. "Well, Eli Rourke, harbor pilot. Let's find out why your heart's trying to get your attention." It took 2 visits to properly diagnose what was happening. An arrhythmia, benign in isolation but clearly agitated by something, Micah said, watching Eli with careful, unhurried attention that felt less like a doctor cataloging symptoms and more like a man trying to read a book written in a language he was determined to learn. "Your heart's healthy," Micah told him at the second appointment, sliding his stethoscope back around his neck. "Structurally, there's nothing wrong with it. But something's driving these episodes, and stress does strange things to a body that's spent a long time holding itself very still. I'd like you to tell me what's going on in your life, if you're willing." Eli looked at his hands. "That's a long list. I've got time," Micah said, and something in the way he said it, unhurried, patient, without a single flicker of the polite impatience Eli had learned to expect from people asking questions they didn't really want answered, made Eli believe him. He didn't tell Micah the truth that day. Not yet. But he came back a 3rd time and a 4th, ostensibly to monitor his heart rate, and somewhere in the space between the 2nd and the 5th appointment, Eli noticed himself looking forward to the 15 minutes in that small exam room with an eagerness he hadn't let himself feel about another person in years. It was on the 5th visit that Eli first noticed Micah's hands. Not clinically, not the way a patient notices a doctor's hands, but the way you notice something you want to remember. Micah had scarred knuckles on his right hand, a thin white line across 2 fingers, and when Eli asked about it, unable to stop himself, Micah went quiet for a moment before answering. He said it lightly, but something moved behind his eyes, some door closing gently before Eli could see through it, and Eli recognized the gesture because he made it himself, constantly, about 100 different subjects. That night, driving home along the coast road with the heater rattling and the radio turned low, Eli found himself thinking about Micah's hands instead of the ocean, and it frightened him enough that he didn't schedule another appointment for 2 weeks. In the interval, he told himself firmly that whatever he'd felt in that exam room was simple loneliness dressed up as something more interesting. He kept to his routine, the diner, the harbor, the long silent evenings in his apartment above the chandlery, and tried not to notice how much duller all of it felt without the small, stolen anticipation of seeing Micah again. He drove past the clinic twice on invented errands, telling himself he only needed milk, only needed to check the tide charts posted in the window of the harbor office next door, and both times he caught himself slowing the truck as he passed, eyes flicking toward the lit windows, hoping for a glimpse of a man he had no right to be hoping for. His mother, 3 years gone now, used to say that Eli fell into things slowly and then all at once, the way the tide crept up a beach until, without warning, it simply owned the whole shore. He thought of her often in those 2 weeks, not with the sharp grief of her first year gone, but with the softer, permanent ache of missing someone whose voice he still heard clearly whenever he needed steadying. She had been the one who told him, quietly, the week after the photograph surfaced and his father went silent, that some men needed more time than others to learn a new shape of loving their sons, and that Eli should be patient with his father the way he'd want his father to be patient with him. She had died believing that patience would eventually pay off. Eli hoped, driving past the clinic for the second time in 1 week, that she'd been right about more than just his father. He came back because the chest pains got worse, not better, and because, if he was honest with the version of himself that only came out on empty roads at night, some reckless, hopeful part of him wanted to see Micah Bennett again badly enough to justify it with a symptom. The 6th appointment was different. Micah had him lie back on the exam table to listen to his heart, and there was a long moment where neither of them spoke, where Eli was aware of nothing but the warmth of Micah's hand steadying the stethoscope against his chest, the faint scent of cedar and antiseptic, the accidental brush of Micah's knuckles against his collarbone as he adjusted the placement. Neither of them pulled away. Eli held very still, heart doing exactly the unsteady thing it had come here to be diagnosed for, and when he glanced up he found Micah already looking at him. Not at the chart, not at the stethoscope, at him, with an expression that took a full second too long to smooth back into professional neutrality. "Your heart rate just spiked," Micah said quietly. "I noticed," Eli said, and immediately regretted how much that admitted. Micah stepped back, cleared his throat, and busied himself writing something on the chart that Eli suspected had very little to do with cardiology. "I want to ask you something, and you can tell me it's none of my business," Micah said, not looking up. "Is there someone in your life you can talk to? About whatever's underneath all this stress? Family, a partner, a friend?" "Not really," Eli admitted, and the honesty surprised him even as it left his mouth. "I keep most people at arm's length. Habit, I guess. That's a heavy habit to carry alone," Micah said, and there was something in his voice. Not pity, never pity, but a kind of recognition, one guarded man clocking another, that made Eli's chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with arrhythmia. He didn't confess anything that day, but he left the clinic feeling like something had shifted half an inch, some tectonic plate under years of frozen ground, and he spent that whole night lying awake, replaying the weight of Micah's hand against his sternum. The town found out, in its slow and thorough way, that the new doctor had lost his husband. Eli heard it from Mrs. Aldous at the diner, who heard it from the pharmacist, who'd processed a prescription with the name of a support group printed at the bottom. "Grief counseling," Mrs. Aldous said, shaking her head sympathetically over Eli's coffee refill. "Poor man. Widower, if you can believe it. Moved up here from Boston to get away from all the reminders. Husband died a couple years back. Car accident, I heard. Terrible thing." Eli sat with that information like a stone in his stomach for 3 days. He hadn't let himself imagine, until then, that Micah might be gay too. Had assumed, the way he assumed about most men in this town, that whatever warmth existed between them was one-directional, born entirely out of Eli's own starved and reckless wanting. Hearing it stated plainly, secondhand, over diner coffee, cracked something open in him that he wasn't prepared for. Hope, dangerous and unfamiliar, the kind he'd trained himself out of years ago. He went back to the clinic the following week without a real symptom to justify it, just a vague complaint about occasional dizziness, and Micah examined him with his usual careful attention before setting his stethoscope aside and looking at Eli directly. "You don't actually have new symptoms, do you?" Micah said, not accusatory, almost amused, in a tired, gentle way. Eli's face went hot. "Is it that obvious? Eli, your vitals have been perfect for 2 visits running. I'm a doctor, not an idiot." Micah leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, and something in his posture loosened, like he'd decided to let a wall down half a degree. "I don't mind, for what it's worth. I like when you come in. It's the best part of my week, if I'm honest, which is a strange thing to admit to a patient." The silence that followed was long and charged, the kind where both men seemed to be standing at the edge of saying something neither was ready to say. Eli opened his mouth twice and closed it twice. Micah watched him do it, patient, unhurried, without pushing. "I heard about your husband," Eli finally said, quieter than he meant to. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bring it up like, I wanted you to know I heard, and I'm sorry, and I didn't want you to think I didn't care." Something moved across Micah's face. Grief, yes, old and familiar, but also something like relief, the specific relief of a secret being handled gently instead of dropped. "Daniel," he said, His name was Daniel. 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days ago. Not that I'm counting. A small, rueful smile. I am obviously counting. You don't have to talk about it, Eli said quickly. I didn't mean to. I know. But I want to. Micah looked at the floor, then back up, and Eli understood, watching him, that this was Micah's version of the thing Eli had been circling for weeks. A door easing open on hinges gone stiff from disuse. It's a small town, and everyone already knows the outline. I'd rather you hear the truth from me than the version that gets embellished at the diner. The 7th appointment wasn't really an appointment at all. Micah caught Eli in the parking lot afterward, both of them lingering with their car keys in hand, neither quite ready to end the conversation, and Micah asked, almost too casually, whether Eli had eaten dinner yet. I could be persuaded to eat again, Eli said, and the smile that broke across Micah's face was worth more to him than he was prepared to admit. They ended up at the one halfway decent restaurant on the wharf, a place with a wood stove and mismatched chairs and a view of the boats knocking gently against their moorings, and it was there, over plates neither of them finished, that Micah told him the rest. Daniel had been an architect, funny and restless and kind, the kind of man who filled a room without trying. They'd been married 4 years when the accident happened. Black ice. A bad curve outside Boston. A call at 2 in the morning that Micah still heard sometimes in the quiet moments right before sleep. What Micah hadn't told anyone in Holloway Cove, what he told Eli now in a voice gone low and careful, was the guilt that had followed him here like a second shadow. Daniel had been struggling in the months before the accident, quietly, in ways Micah, a doctor, a man trained to notice exactly this kind of suffering, had somehow failed to see clearly enough, fast enough. He didn't know, still, whether the accident had been only an accident. He would probably never know. He had left his practice in Boston, left the house full of Daniel's drafting tables and half-finished blueprints, and come back to the small coastal town where he'd grown up because he didn't trust himself to keep living in a city that remembered his husband on every corner. I've never told anyone that part, Micah said, turning his water glass slowly on the table. The part where I'm a physician who missed the signs in the person I loved most. It doesn't exactly inspire confidence in your local doctor. Eli reached across the table without entirely deciding to and set his hand over Micah's, stilling the restless turning of the glass. It was the first deliberate touch either of them had made. Not an accident of proximity, not a doctor's clinical contact, but a hand placed on purpose and held there on purpose, while the wood stove ticked and the boats knocked against the dock outside. You didn't fail him, Eli said. You're allowed to not have seen something nobody wanted you to see. I know a little something about hiding things from the people who love me. Micah looked down at their hands, then up at Eli's face, something raw and unguarded moving across his features. Is that an invitation to ask what you're hiding? Maybe, Eli said, and his heart was doing the unsteady thing again. And for once he didn't want it to stop. There was a bad storm that came through the following week, the kind that closed the harbor to all but the most necessary traffic, and Eli spent 2 brutal days out on the water anyway, guiding a delayed container ship through swells that had no business being that size so close to shore. He came in on the second night soaked through and half frozen. His hands raw from the lines, a shallow but ugly gash across his forearm where a snapped cable had caught him in the dark. He drove himself straight to the clinic instead of home, some instinct pulling him there before he'd consciously decided anything at all. Micah was still there, finishing paperwork, and the sight of Eli dripping and bleeding in the doorway brought him around the desk so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. Sit down. Sit down right now, Micah said, already reaching for gauze, his voice gone tight with a fear he didn't try very hard to hide. What happened? Cable snapped. It's not as bad as it looks, Eli said, though his hands were shaking too hard to be entirely convincing. Micah cleaned the wound with hands that were gentle even in their urgency, working in careful, practiced silence, and Eli watched his face in the harsh exam room light, the furrow of concentration between his brows, the way his jaw tightened every time Eli hissed at the antiseptic. When it came time to stitch the gash closed, Micah paused, his fingers resting lightly against Eli's forearm, just above the wound. You scared me, Micah admitted quietly, not looking up. Walking in here like that. I don't think I've been that scared since. He stopped himself, but they both knew where the sentence had been headed. "I'm okay," Eli said, and reached over with his good hand to still Micah's. The same gesture Micah so often used to steady him. "I'm right here." Micah exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders, and finished the stitches with a tenderness that had nothing to do with clinical necessity. When he was done, he didn't immediately let go of Eli's arm. His thumb traced, absently, an old, faded scar higher up near Eli's elbow, silver-white and long-heeled. "What's this one from?" Micah asked. "Boat propeller. I was 9. My father's boat, actually. I fell in reaching for a line I had no business reaching for, and the prop caught my arm before he could cut the engine." Eli looked down at the old scar, the memory dulled by time into something almost fond. "He didn't speak to me for a week afterward, but not the bad kind of quiet. The kind where a man's too scared by how close he came to losing something to know what to say about it." Micah's thumb stilled over the scar, something thoughtful and tender in his expression. "I have one too," he said, and rolled up his own sleeve to show a thin, pale line along his ribs, mostly hidden beneath his shirt. "Appendix badly timed, during my 2nd year of residency. I operated on my own patients 3 days later against every piece of good medical advice, because I didn't know how to sit still long enough to let myself heal properly. Daniel used to tease me that I'd rather bleed than rest." "Sounds like a stubborn man," Eli said softly. "The stubbornest," Micah agreed, something warm and grieving in his voice at once. "You'd have liked him, I think. And I think he would have liked you. He always said the people worth keeping were the ones who showed up covered in someone else's storm and let you patch them back together anyway." They sat together a while longer after that, Eli's freshly stitched arm resting in Micah's careful hands, neither of them in any hurry to end the quiet, and Eli understood, in the softening hush of the exam room, that something between them had shifted permanently. Two scarred men, showing each other the old wounds, and finding in the telling not pity but a strange, steady kind of intimacy neither of them had expected to survive long enough to feel again. There was a complication neither of them had reckoned with yet, and it surfaced only a few days after the wharf dinner, when Micah called Eli into the clinic for what he called stiffly over the phone an important conversation, not a medical one. Eli arrived to find Micah pacing behind his desk, a folder open in front of him that he kept touching and not reading. "I looked into it properly," Micah said without preamble, "and I can't in good conscience keep treating you as a patient while whatever this is between us keeps growing. There's a conflict of interest. If anyone ever filed a complaint, if this ever went sideways between us, it could cost me my license, and worse, it could hurt you, being written up as some kind of cautionary tale in a town this small. I should have thought about it sooner. I think some reckless part of me didn't want to, because thinking about it meant admitting how much I already wanted this to keep growing." "So what are you saying?" Eli asked carefully, dread pooling low in his stomach. "I'm saying I called Dr. Okafor over in Camden this morning and asked if she'd take over your cardiac follow-up." Micah finally stopped pacing, met his eyes. "I'm saying I don't want to stop seeing you, Eli. I want the opposite of that, badly enough that it scares me. But I want to do this properly, without a professional line hanging over both our heads every time we sit across from each other. I'd rather lose you as a patient than risk losing the chance to be something more than that to you." Eli felt something in him loosen with relief even as another part of him tightened with a fresh kind of nerves. The strange vertigo of watching a careful, guarded man make a decision that was entirely about protecting a future neither of them had officially claimed yet. "You're really doing this." "I already did it," Micah said. "Your first appointment with her is Thursday. I made sure she's good, better than good, actually one of the best cardiologists in the county. You'll be in excellent hands." He hesitated, then added, quieter, "I just didn't want to keep being your doctor when what I actually want is to be the person you come home to instead." It took Eli a moment to find his voice. "That's either the most romantic or the most bureaucratic thing anyone's ever said to me." Micah huffed a surprised laugh, some of the tension breaking in his shoulders. "Probably both. I am, after all, a man who fell for his own patient and then filed the paperwork to fix it properly instead of just hoping nobody noticed." The following Thursday, Eli drove to Camden for his first appointment with Dr. Okafor, a brisk, warm woman who took one look at his chart, one look at his slightly nervous face, and said dryly, "Micah Bennett referred you awfully fast for a stable arrhythmia. Should I ask why? Or would you rather I mind my own business?" Eli had laughed, caught, and admitted the truth. And Dr. Okafor had simply smiled and said she'd wondered when Micah would finally let himself have something good again, and that she was glad to hear he finally had. That evening, freed at last from any professional shadow hanging over them, Eli drove straight to Cliffside Road instead of home, and found Micah waiting on the porch as though he'd known exactly when to expect him. Neither of them said anything for a long moment, just stood there in the cold appraising each other with something new in the air between them. Unguarded, uncomplicated, finally free of the quiet asterisk that had followed every tender moment since the day they'd met. No conflict of interest left to worry about, Eli said finally. None at all, Micah agreed, and the smile that broke across his face then was the widest, most unguarded one Eli had seen yet. He didn't tell Micah everything that night. Winter settled harder over Holloway Cove in the weeks that followed, ice forming thick along the tide line, and Eli found the shape of his days rearranging itself around a man he'd known only a handful of weeks. He noticed it in small, foolish ways, choosing the harbor route that passed closest to the clinic windows, lingering an extra 10 minutes over coffee if he thought Micah might come in for his own before rounds, replaying entire conversations on his drive home like a teenager instead of a man well into his 30s. There was an evening, a week after the wharf dinner, when the town held its annual Winter Lantern Walk, a tradition older than either of their families, where the whole community strung paper lanterns along Anchor Street and walked down to the harbor together against the dark. Eli hadn't planned to go. He usually avoided it, uneasy in crowds where he had to perform an entire careful self for 2 straight hours. But he went that year, telling himself it was for the fresh air, and found Micah near the bakery stall, laughing at something Mrs. Aldous had said, lantern light catching gold in his dark hair. You came, Micah said, when he spotted him, and something in his face lit brighter than any lantern on the street. They ended up walking the whole length of Anchor Street side by side, close enough that their arms brushed every few steps, neither of them moving away from the contact. Eli noticed, with a small, private thrill, that Micah kept finding reasons to touch his sleeve, to point something out, to steady himself on the icy cobblestones, and each time, the touch lingered half a second longer than it strictly needed to. It was near the end of the walk, the crowd thinning as people peeled off toward home, that a man Eli didn't recognize fell into step on Micah's other side. Tall, well-dressed, clearly not local, greeting Micah with an easy familiarity that made something ugly and unfamiliar twist low in Eli's stomach. Micah Bennett, as I live and breathe, the man said, clapping Micah on the shoulder. I didn't know you'd gone full lighthouse hermit. Boston misses you. Callum. Micah's voice went careful, a little strained. What are you doing up here? Visiting my sister in Camden. Heard you'd hold up an hour north. Thought I'd swing by and see if you'd finally rejoined the land of the living. Callum's eyes flicked to Eli with open curiosity. And who's this? Eli Rourke? Eli said, offering a hand he hoped didn't betray how tightly his jaw had clenched. Friend of Micah's. Friend? Callum repeated, drawing the word out with a small, knowing smile that made Eli's ears burn. Well, good. He needs friends up here. Daniel would have hated the idea of him rattling around alone in some old house by the water. The name landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. Micah's smile went thin and brittle, and Eli watched, helpless, as some of the light he'd carried all evening dimmed. Callum didn't seem to notice. He chattered on for another minute about mutual acquaintances in Boston before excusing himself to find his sister, leaving an uncomfortable quiet in his wake. They walked the last stretch to the harbor without speaking. Eli felt the ugly twist in his stomach settle into something closer to shame, jealousy. He realized belatedly, an unfamiliar and unflattering emotion he hadn't expected to feel over a man who wasn't even his to feel possessive about. He was searching for something to say when Micah spoke first, voice low. Callum was Daniel's college roommate. He means well. He's just never quite figured out how to talk about Daniel without also talking about the version of me that existed before all this. Micah gestured vaguely at the harbor, the lanterns, the whole quiet architecture of his new life. Sometimes I think Boston people believe grief has an expiration date and I pass mine somewhere around year 1, and now I'm just supposed to be fine. You don't owe anyone a timeline, Eli said, and meant it fiercely enough that Micah glanced over at him, surprised. Grief doesn't work like that. Neither does anything else that matters. Micah was quiet for a moment, studying him in the lantern light. "You looked like you wanted to throw him in the harbor," he said finally, a small, testing smile returning to his mouth. Eli felt his face heat again. "Caught. I don't know what that was." "I think I do," Micah said, softer now, and didn't elaborate, but the way he said it, warm, a little astonished, entirely too pleased, told Eli that whatever ugly, possessive thing had flared up in him hadn't gone unnoticed, and hadn't been unwelcome either. There was an emergency, not long after the lantern walk, that pulled them together in a way neither of them expected. A deckhand on one of the trawlers Eli had guided into harbor that morning slipped on an icy ladder and came down wrong. His leg bent at an angle that made two of the older fishermen go pale just looking at it. Eli was the one who reached him first, kneeling on the frozen dock boards, stripping off his own coat to keep the man warm and still while someone ran for help. His voice low and steady even as his hands shook with adrenaline. "Look at me, Sully. Look right at me, you're gonna be fine. Help's coming. Just breathe with me." Micah arrived at a dead run, black bag in hand, and dropped to his knees on Eli's other side without a word, assessing the break with quick, practiced hands. For a few tense minutes there was no room for anything but the crisis itself. Micah issuing calm, clipped instructions, Eli following them instantly and without question. The two of them moving around the injured man in a wordless, efficient rhythm that felt, strangely, like the most natural collaboration Eli had ever been part of. When the ambulance from the county seat finally arrived 20 minutes later, Sully stable and splinted and already cracking weak jokes about missing the football pool, Eli realized his hand had been resting the entire time against the man's shoulder, steadying him, and that Micah's hand had been resting, just as steadily, against Eli's own back. They stood together on the dock afterward, watching the ambulance pull away, both of them still running on the last of the adrenaline, breath clouding in the cold air. "You were good in there," Micah said quietly, looking at him with something like awe. "Calm. Exactly what he needed. I learned it from my father," Eli admitted. "Boats break people sometimes. You learn to keep your voice steady even when you're not, because panic spreads faster than the injury does." Micah studied him a moment longer, something shifting behind his eyes. Not just gratitude, but a kind of falling, slow and unmistakable. "I don't think I've ever watched anyone hold someone together like that," he said. "It's a remarkable thing to witness." "You're a remarkable thing to witness, Eli Rourke, and I'm having a very hard time pretending otherwise today." Eli felt his pulse do something complicated that had nothing to do with the leftover adrenaline. "Micah!" Whatever he might have said next was lost when one of the harbor crew called Eli's name from further down the dock, needing him back at the wheelhouse to finish logging the incident, and the moment passed, unfinished, the way so many of their moments still did in those early weeks, close enough to touch, and then swept away by the ordinary business of living in a small town where everyone needed something from both of them at once. There was a long stretch after that, nearly 2 weeks, where something between them seemed to stall. Eli blamed himself for it privately, for the jealousy he couldn't quite explain away, for the fear that had crept back in after Callum's visit, reminding him too clearly of everything Micah had already lost and everything Eli himself still hadn't found the courage to say plainly. He kept his appointments at the clinic brief and professional, terrified of overstepping some line he couldn't quite locate, and Micah, for his part, seemed to retreat a half step too, quieter than usual, more careful. It came to a head on a Thursday evening when Eli, driving home from a long shift guiding a delayed cargo ship through the channel, spotted Micah's car still parked outside the clinic long after closing hours. On impulse, he pulled in. He found Micah sitting alone in the dark waiting room, lights off except for the small lamp on the reception desk, staring at nothing in particular. "You're here late," Eli said carefully from the doorway. Micah looked up, startled. Then something in his shoulders loosened at the sight of him. "Bad anniversary today. Daniel's birthday would have been this week. I always seem to lose an evening around this time of year." He rubbed a hand over his face. "I didn't want to go home to an empty house just yet." Eli came and sat beside him without asking permission, close enough that their knees nearly touched, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all. It was, Eli would think later, one of the quietest, most intimate moments they'd shared yet. No grand gesture, no confession, just two men sitting together in a dim room while one of them grieved and the other simply stayed. "I've been keeping my distance," Eli finally admitted into the quiet. The last couple weeks. I think I got scared after that night with Callum. Watching you carry something that big made me realize how much I still haven't told you, and I got scared of not measuring up to it. Micah turned to look at him properly. You don't have to measure up to anything. Grief isn't a competition, and neither is whatever this is. He gestured vaguely between them. I noticed the distance. I thought maybe I'd imagined all of it, what I felt building between us. I thought maybe I'd projected something onto you because I was lonely and you were kind to me, and I didn't want to embarrass either of us by saying so. You didn't imagine anything, Eli said, low and certain. I've never wanted anything the way I want to keep being near you. I just don't know how to do that without eventually telling you everything. And telling you everything terrifies me more than anything has in years. Micah reached over in the dim lamp light and took Eli's hand. Not urgently, not with any particular weight of expectation, just a quiet, steady offering. Whenever you're ready, he said. I'm not going anywhere. He told him 3 days later on the town dock at dusk, the same dock where, weeks from then, they would stand again under a lighthouse beam and finally say the words neither of them had dared say yet. That first confession was smaller, quieter, but no less enormous to the man making it. I need to tell you something, Eli said, stopping at the halfway point of the dock where the wind cut hardest. And I need you to let me get all the way through it before you say anything, because if you interrupt me, I don't think I'll finish. Micah went still, attentive, the same patient stillness he brought to every difficult conversation. Okay. I'm gay, Eli said, and the words landed strange and enormous in the cold air. 12 years of silence collapsing into 2 syllables. I have been my whole life. I came out to my father when I was 21. By accident, not on purpose, and he didn't say a single unkind word to me. He just went quiet, and he's been quiet about it for 12 years. And somewhere along the way I decided it was easier to disappear a whole piece of myself than to keep watching him go quiet. So I did. I built a life here where nobody sees the real shape of me. There was a man in Portland for a while who wanted things I couldn't give him. Dinners in public, a name spoken aloud to people who mattered. I let him go rather than risk being known. And I don't know how to keep doing that anymore, Micah. Because ever since you moved in down the street from my whole careful, hidden life, I have not wanted to hide from you even once. The silence that followed was the longest one they'd had. Eli watched Micah's face carefully, braced for something. Surprise, pity, the polite retreat he'd learned to expect from anyone who got close enough to see him clearly. But what he saw instead was something closer to recognition, and underneath the recognition, something that looked almost like hope trying to remember how to exist again. Eli. Micah's voice cracked slightly on the name. I need you to know something too. And I think I've been circling it for weeks without letting myself say it plainly. Daniel wasn't just my husband. He was the greatest love of my life. And when I lost him, I promised myself I'd never let anyone else matter that much again, because I couldn't survive losing someone that way twice. He stepped closer, close enough that Eli could see the fine lines of worry at the corners of his eyes, close enough that their coats nearly brushed. And then I met you. And every promise I made myself in that hospital corridor 2 years ago has been quietly falling apart ever since. So what do we do with that? Eli asked, barely above a whisper. I don't know, Micah admitted. I'm terrified, if I'm honest. Terrified of wanting something this much again. But I'm more terrified of the alternative, which is watching you walk back into hiding and pretending I don't feel what I feel. They didn't kiss that night. Neither of them was ready. Not yet. Both of them too aware of how much was at stake, how much courage it would take to let 2 carefully guarded lives crack open at the same time. But Micah reached over and laced his fingers through Eli's, and they stood there at the halfway point of the dock until the lighthouse keeper flipped the switch and the beam began its slow, steady sweep across the water, and neither of them let go. The days that followed were a slow unraveling of all the careful distance they'd both maintained. Eli found himself at the clinic on his lunch breaks with no excuse at all, just to sit in the back room and drink the tea Micah kept stocked for him now, watching him move between exam rooms with an ease that made something in Eli's chest ache pleasantly. One afternoon, Eli arrived to find Micah crouched on the floor of the supply closet, quietly cursing at a fallen box of gauze that had scattered across the floor, and without a word Eli got down on his knees beside him and started gathering the mess, their shoulders pressed together in the cramped space, laughing under their breath at the absurdity of it. And it was the kind of small domestic moment that felt, to Eli, far more intimate than anything grand could have been. There was another afternoon, a Saturday, when Micah asked, almost shy about it, whether Eli might want to help him fix a leaning fence post at the little house on Cliffside Road, and the two of them spent an hour in the weak winter sun arguing amiably about the correct angle for a post hole. Micah's hands dusted with dirt, his sleeves rolled up despite the cold, and Eli found himself staring at the line of his forearms with an intensity that had nothing to do with fence posts at all. When Micah caught him looking, he didn't look away either, just held Eli's gaze for one long, charged beat, a slow smile spreading across his face, before turning back to the post as though nothing had happened, though the air between them stayed warm for the rest of the afternoon. There was a night, not long after, when Micah came down with a bad flu in Eli. Despite having no real excuse to be there, despite the risk of what the town might say about the harbor pilot spending his evenings at the new doctor's little house, showed up anyway with soup he'd made himself, badly, from a recipe his mother used to make. He found Micah pale and shivering under a quilt on the couch, and something protective and fierce rose up in Eli that he hadn't expected. Some instinct to shield this man from every hard thing the world had thrown at him. "You didn't have to come," Micah said, voice thick with congestion, even as he made room on the couch without being asked. "I know," Eli said, settling in beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, close enough to feel the fever heat radiating off Micah's skin. "I wanted to." He stayed the whole night, dozing upright with Micah's head eventually finding its way to his shoulder somewhere around midnight, and in the gray hours before dawn Eli lay very still, unwilling to move and disturb the fragile, trusting weight of Micah asleep against him, thinking that he had never in his life felt so certain of anything as he felt certain, in that moment, that he wanted to keep being the person Micah leaned on. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, Micah stirred, feverish and half awake, and murmured something against Eli's shoulder that might have been a question or might only have been the fever talking. "Why do you keep showing up?" he mumbled, eyes still closed, "when I've got nothing good to offer you back right now?" "That's not true," Eli said quietly, thinking he was speaking to a sleeping man. "You've got everything. You just don't know it yet because you've spent 2 years convincing yourself you don't deserve to have it again." He hesitated, throat tight, the words rising up in him with a suddenness that frightened him. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he thought, so clearly it felt like he'd said it aloud. He opened his mouth, the confession right there at the edge of his teeth, and stopped himself, throat closing around it, old habit clamping down hard and fast. Micah was sick and vulnerable and only half conscious. It wasn't fair to hand a man a confession like that when he couldn't even choose whether to hear it. Eli swallowed the words back down, the way he'd swallowed so many things over so many years, and told himself it wasn't fear, it was simply timing, though some smaller, more honest part of him suspected the two were not so easily separated after all. "You're rambling," Eli said instead, softer, brushing damp hair back from Micah's forehead. "Go back to sleep." Micah made a small, sleepy sound of agreement and settled deeper against him, and Eli lay awake a long while after, listening to him breathe, wondering how many more nights he could keep almost saying the thing before it finally forced its own way out of him whether he was ready or not. It was, of course, exactly the kind of moment his father would have called something to be quiet about. And it was exactly the kind of moment that made Eli finally understand he didn't want to be quiet anymore. There was, in the middle of all this slow unfolding, a single evening that nearly derailed everything. A misunderstanding neither of them saw coming. Eli had driven up unannounced to Cliffside Road one evening, wanting only to see him, and found an unfamiliar car in the driveway. Through the front window he could see Micah standing close with another man, dark-haired, about Micah's age, their heads bent together over something on the kitchen table. Eli sat frozen in his truck for a full minute, that same ugly twist from the lantern walk rising in his chest tenfold, an old, familiar voice in his head insisting this was exactly why he never should have let himself hope for something so plainly, dangerously good. He nearly drove away without knocking. He didn't. Some new, stubborn part of him, the part that had told his father the truth, the part that had said "I'm gay" out loud on a windswept dock, made him get out of the truck instead and knock on the door. Micah opened it, surprise and warmth breaking across his face at the sight of him, and behind him, the dark-haired stranger looked up with polite curiosity. Eli, Micah said. Come in, God. It's freezing. This is Renzo, Daniel's younger brother. He's up from New York settling some things with Daniel's storage unit and needed somewhere to sort through boxes tonight. Renzo, this is Eli. The relief that flooded through Eli was so acute it was almost embarrassing. Renzo turned out to be soft-spoken and kind, grieving his brother in his own quiet way, and the three of them ended up sharing a pot of tea at the kitchen table while Renzo told stories about Daniel as a boy. Stubborn, brilliant, always building something out of whatever he could find. Eli watched Micah listen to those stories with an expression of tender, complicated grief, and understood, more clearly than he had before, the full weight of what Micah carried, and how much trust it took for him to let Eli witness it. Later, after Renzo had gone up to the guest room, Eli found Micah on the back porch, staring out at the dark water. I saw you through the window before I knocked, Eli admitted. I almost left. I thought. He stopped, embarrassed by how small and foolish the fear sounded now, spoken aloud. You thought I'd found someone else already, Micah finished gently, without judgment. I understand why that thought exists in you, Eli. I don't think it's foolish at all. But it isn't true and it isn't going to be true. I'm not going anywhere looking for someone else. I already found the person I wasn't looking for. Eli exhaled something that was almost a laugh, almost a sob, relief and love tangled together so tightly he couldn't separate them. I keep waiting to stop being scared of losing this before I've even fully let myself have it. Maybe you don't have to stop being scared, Micah said, stepping closer, close enough now that Eli could feel the warmth coming off him in the cold air. Maybe you just have to be scared and stay anyway. That's most of what love actually is, I think. I was terrified every day I loved Daniel, and it was still the best thing I ever did with my fear. There was a Sunday not long after Renzo's visit when Eli showed up at Cliffside Road with a bag of groceries and the stated intention of teaching Micah how to properly make his mother's pancake recipe. A ritual she'd passed down that Eli had never once shared with anyone outside his own family. It went badly in the best possible way. Micah, it turned out, was a disaster in a kitchen despite 2 years of living alone and presumably feeding himself daily. He measured flour by eye and got it wrong every time. He forgot the batter needed resting. He set off the smoke detector attempting to flip the first pancake with more confidence than skill, and Eli laughed harder than he had in longer than he could remember. Flour dusted across both their shirts, batter dripped on the floor, the whole kitchen filled with the warm chaos of two grown men failing spectacularly at something simple and not minding at all. In my defense, Micah said, scraping a blackened pancake into the trash with as much dignity as he could muster, Daniel used to do all the cooking. I specialized in reheating things he'd already made and taking credit for them. That tracks, Eli said, still grinning, and reached over to wipe a smear of batter from Micah's cheek with his thumb. The gesture unthinking and easy in a way that surprised them both with how natural it felt. Micah went still under the touch, something warm and quiet passing over his face, and for a moment neither of them moved, the kitchen gone silent except for the low hiss of the griddle. You're gonna have to keep doing that, Micah said softly, wiping things off my face, fixing my terrible pancakes. I could get used to a lot of ordinary mornings like this one. I could too, Eli admitted, voice low, and it struck him, standing there in a stranger's kitchen that had somehow stopped feeling like a stranger's kitchen months ago, that this flour and smoke detectors and Micah's laughter was exactly the kind of quiet, unremarkable domestic happiness he'd never let himself imagine wanting, because wanting it had always seemed like wanting something built specifically to be taken away from him. They ate the edible pancakes together at the small kitchen table, knees bumping companionably underneath it, and when they'd finished, Micah reached across and took his hand, thumb tracing slow, absent circles over Eli's knuckles, neither of them in any particular hurry to be anywhere else in the world. Winter began, finally, to loosen its hold on Holloway Cove. Ice retreated from the tide line, and the light stayed a little longer each evening, and somewhere in that slow turning of the season, Eli found himself walking into town hall one Thursday afternoon to stand up, unasked, for the man he loved. It happened at a public meeting about clinic funding, of all places, a handful of the town's older residents grumbling that the new doctor's rates had gone up, that Halvorsen had never charged so much, that maybe a big city fella like Bennett didn't understand small-town finances. Eli, sitting near the back, felt something in him go rigid with an anger that surprised him with its intensity. "He took a pay cut moving up here that most of you can't imagine," Eli said, standing before he'd fully decided to, his voice carrying clearly across the room. Heads turned. He kept going anyway. He drove 2 hours in the middle of the night in October to stitch up Sam Pelletier's kid after that bike accident, free of charge, because Sam didn't have insurance yet. He's the first doctor in this town in 15 years who actually knows every one of his patients by name, including the ones who show up complaining about rates they've never once been overcharged for. If you want to keep a good doctor in a town this small, you don't nickel and dime the one who actually stayed. The room went quiet. Someone near the front murmured agreement. Someone else nodded slowly. The complaint didn't fully die that afternoon. Small-town grievances rarely do. But the tenor of the room shifted, and afterward, in the parking lot, Micah caught up to him, something bright and stunned in his expression. "You didn't have to do that," Micah said. "You could have just sat there." "I know," Eli said. "I didn't want to." Micah looked at him for a long moment, the last of the afternoon light catching gold in his eyes, and something passed between them that felt like a threshold quietly crossed. Eli defending him not in some private, hidden way, but in front of the very town Eli had spent 12 years trying not to be seen by. "That's the first time anyone stood up for me like that since Daniel," Micah said quietly. "I forgot what it felt like." "Get used to it," Eli said, and meant it as a promise. There was, in the interval between the town hall meeting and the confrontation with his father, a quieter evening that Eli would return to often in his memory in the months that followed. Not dramatic, not a turning point exactly, but somehow essential to everything that came after. Holloway Cove held a modest early spring lobster bake down at the public beach each year, more for the fishing families than for tourists, a tradition of driftwood fires and steamed lobster and children running barefoot in the cold surf while the adults stood around in flannel drinking cheap beer. Eli had gone every year of his life and never once brought anyone. That year he brought Micah, and told himself it wasn't a statement, though of course it was. They ended up seated on an overturned dinghy near the edge of the firelight, plates balanced on their knees, close enough that their shoulders pressed together against the evening chill. Someone had brought a guitar. Someone else was teaching a cluster of children how to properly crack a claw. Eli found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, simply present in his own town, not performing carefulness, not monitoring which parts of himself were safe to show. "You look different tonight," Micah observed quietly, watching him over the rim of a paper cup. "Different how?" "Unguarded." Micah smiled, small and genuine. "It's a good look on you." Eli felt his face warm, grateful for the firelight's excuse to explain it. "I haven't come to one of these in years without spending the whole night bracing for someone to ask me why I'm alone again. And tonight I'm not alone," Eli said simply, and watched something soft and pleased move across Micah's face in response. Later, after most of the fire had burned down to embers and the children had been carried home sleepy and sandy, Eli and Micah stayed behind to help fold up the borrowed tables, working in easy, comfortable silence broken only by the occasional practical instruction. "Grab that end, watch the leg, careful, it sticks." It was, Eli thought, exactly the kind of quiet domestic moment that meant more to him than any grand declaration could have. Two men doing an ordinary chore together in the dark, unremarkable to anyone watching, and entirely, privately significant to the two of them. When the last table was stacked, Micah straightened, brushing sand from his knees, and caught Eli watching him in the dying firelight. Neither of them looked away. The moment stretched, comfortable rather than awkward, both of them simply allowing themselves to be seen looking, until Micah finally broke the silence with a soft laugh. "You're gonna have to stop looking at me like that in public eventually," he said, "or this whole town's gonna figure out our secret a lot sooner than either of us has actually said it out loud." "Maybe I don't mind that as much as I used to," Eli admitted, surprising himself with how true it felt to say it. They walked back to the truck along the Tittle-line, close enough that their hands brushed with every other step, and on the fourth or fifth brush, Micah simply caught Eli's hand and held it, unhurried, unafraid, the two of them walking the rest of the way in a silence that said far more than either of them had yet found the words for. The confrontation with his own father came not long after, sooner than Eli expected, and not in the way he'd planned. Warren Rourke found out the way most things found their way through Holloway Cove. sideways, through someone else's mouth, filtered through assumption and small-town speculation, perhaps helped along by whoever had been at that town hall meeting. He showed up at Eli's apartment on a Sunday afternoon, weathered and stiff in his good coat, and stood in the doorway like a man bracing against wind that wasn't there. "Folks are saying you've been seen around town with the new doctor," Warren said, without preamble. "A lot. Standing up for him at meetings, of all things." Eli's stomach dropped, old fear rising fast and automatic, the same fear that had kept him quiet for 12 years. But something in him, something that had been slowly built up over these weeks of Micah's patient, steady presence, refused to fold this time. "We're friends," Eli said, and then, because the old silence had cost him too much for too long, he made himself keep going. "Actually, we're becoming something more than friends, Dad, and I think you already suspect that, and I think it's time I stopped letting you wonder in silence instead of just telling you the truth. I'm gay. I've been gay my whole life. I was gay when that picture surfaced 12 years ago and you went quiet on me, and I've been gay every day since while you kept being quiet, and I am so tired of being quiet back." Warren didn't say anything for a long, terrible moment. Eli watched his father's jaw work, watched the old fisherman's face that had weathered 50 New England winters struggle with something that looked almost like grief. "I wasn't quiet because I was ashamed of you," Warren finally said, voice rough. "I was quiet because I didn't know how to say the right thing, and I was scared that whatever I said would be the wrong thing, and it was easier to say nothing at all than to risk saying something that would push you further away. I've regretted that silence every day for 12 years, son. I just never knew how to break it." It wasn't the confession Eli had spent 12 years bracing for. It wasn't rejection at all. It was a father's own fear, worn into the same shape as Eli's, both of them silent for so long out of the same wound, misreading each other's quiet as condemnation instead of what it actually was. Two frightened men who loved each other and didn't know how to say so. They didn't resolve everything that afternoon. Old silences don't unravel in a single conversation. But Warren stepped inside, finally, and sat at Eli's kitchen table and asked, haltingly, clumsily but sincerely, what the new doctor's name was, and whether he made Eli happy, and Eli found himself crying for the first time in longer than he could remember. Not from grief this time, but from the strange, overwhelming relief of being seen. Before he went to Micah that evening, Eli did something he hadn't done in almost a year. He drove out to the small cemetery on the hill above the cove, where his mother was buried beneath a plain granite stone overlooking the water she'd loved her whole life, and stood there a long while in the cold, saying nothing out loud, just letting himself feel the particular ache of wanting someone gone to know about someone new. He brought Micah there 3 days later on a mild, overcast afternoon, without any grand explanation. Just asked if he'd come for a drive, and led him up the hill path in silence until they stood together in front of the stone reading Margaret and Rourke, beloved wife and mother, who loved this water more than she ever feared it. "I've never brought anyone here," Eli said quietly. "Not even the man I saw in Portland, for the whole year we were together. I didn't want to give him a reason to ask questions about my family I wasn't ready to answer." He crouched down and brushed a few stray leaves from the base of the stone, an old, familiar gesture. "She's the one who taught me that patience could fix things silence had broken. I think she'd have liked you. I think she'd have been glad, honestly, that I finally let someone see all of it instead of just the parts one thought were safe to show." Micah crouched down beside him, quiet and careful, and rested a hand against the cold granite as though greeting her properly. "Thank you for bringing me," he said simply. "I know exactly what it costs to let someone stand at a grave that matters this much to you. I don't take it lightly." They stayed until the light began to fade, Micah listening while Eli told small, ordinary stories about her. The way she used to sing off-key while gutting fish at the kitchen sink, the particular scolding voice she'd use whenever Eli or his father tracked sand through her clean kitchen. The summer she taught him to swim by simply wading out into the cove herself and calling his name until he found the courage to follow, and by the time they walked back down the hill together, hands loosely linked, Eli felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't expected. The sense that his mother's memory and his growing love for Micah were no longer separate rooms in his life, but part of the very same house. He told Micah about the confrontation with his father that same evening, sitting on the little porch of Micah's house on Cliffside Road. The two of them wrapped in the same blanket against the cold, and Micah listened with his whole attention, the way he always did, before reaching over and brushing a stray tear from Eli's cheek with his thumb. A gesture so tender that Eli's breath caught in his throat. "I'm proud of you," Micah said quietly. "That took more courage than most people ever have to find in a lifetime." "I almost didn't do it," Eli admitted. "I've spent 12 years being the person who doesn't do it. But I kept thinking about you, about how much energy I've spent hiding, and how none of that hiding ever actually made me safe. It just made me alone. I didn't want to be alone anymore. Not when there was a chance at this instead." "There's a chance at this," Micah echoed softly, testing the words. Then, quieter still, "I want there to be a chance at this. I've wanted it for weeks, if I'm honest, and I've been too scared to say it plainly because saying it plainly means admitting I might lose someone again, and I don't know if I survive that a second time." "You don't have to know that yet," Eli said. "Nobody gets a guarantee. Not you, not me, not anybody who's ever loved somebody. All you get is now and whether you're brave enough to be in it." Micah looked at him for a long moment, something fragile and hopeful moving behind his eyes, and then he reached up and touched the side of Eli's face, thumb tracing his jaw with a gentleness that made Eli's whole body still. "I'm trying to be brave enough," Micah whispered. "I'm trying, Eli." They almost kissed then. Eli felt the whole world narrow down to the inch of cold air between them, felt Micah's breath ghost warm against his mouth. But a delivery truck rumbled past on the road below, headlights sweeping across the porch, and they broke apart, laughing shakily at the absurd timing. The moment interrupted but not gone, just postponed, humming in the air between them like static. Micah pressed his forehead briefly to Eli's, both of them breathing unsteadily in the cold. Soon he murmured half to himself, "Not because of the timing, because I want to be sure when it happens that it isn't rushed or scared or half-formed. I want it to be exactly as certain as everything else I've come to feel about you." "I can wait," Eli said, and found, to his own surprise, that he meant it completely, that the waiting itself, the anticipation humming quietly between them, felt like its own kind of gift after so many years of never letting himself want anything long enough to look forward to it. It was 2 nights later that they found themselves at the end of the town dock in the freezing dark, and everything Eli had been carrying quietly for 34 years finally broke open into words. "Say something," Eli had said, and Micah had gone still, jaw trembling, breath catching like a man holding a door shut against a storm. "I don't know how," Micah had answered. "I don't know how to say this without breaking something." "Then break it," Eli had told him. "I already told you the thing I've spent my whole life hiding. I told you I'm gay. I told you I think I'm in love with you. I don't have anything left to lose by breaking things, Micah. Please, just tell me if I'm standing out here alone." And Micah had taken his hand in the dark, certain and warm, and said, "You're not standing out here alone. You never were. That's kind of the whole problem." Now, standing there with their fingers laced together and the lighthouse beam sweeping steady arcs across the black water, Micah finally turned to face him fully. "I loved Daniel with my whole heart," he said, voice unsteady but clear. "I'm never going to pretend that isn't true, or ask you to compete with it. But loving him taught me what it feels like to build a life with someone, and somewhere in the last 6 weeks, without meaning to, without being ready for it, I started wanting to build something like that again. With you. Only you. I love you, Eli Rourke. I think I've been falling in love with you since the day you sat down in my waiting room and told me you were Harbor family, and I have been fighting it every day since because I was scared, and I am done being scared." Eli felt something inside his chest finally, fully unclench. 12 years of guarded silence, 34 years of holding his breath, all of it releasing at once into the cold night air. "I love you too," he said, and the words came out steady, sure, nothing like the trembling confession he'd rehearsed 100 times in his head, and never once had the courage to say aloud to anyone. "I trusted you with the truth about myself before I trusted anyone else in my whole life, and you gave me yours right back. I don't want to spend one more day pretending that isn't the most important thing that's ever happened to me." Micah closed the last small distance between them, and this time nothing interrupted it. No delivery truck, no fear, no old silence standing guard. He cupped Eli's face in both hands, cold fingers steady against Eli's jaw, and kissed him slowly, carefully. like a man who had spent 2 years believing he'd never again let himself want something this much and had just discovered, with enormous relief, that he'd been wrong. Eli kissed him back with everything he'd been holding in for over a decade, the lighthouse beams sweeping over them again and again, gold light and darkness taking turns across their faces, and neither of them pulled away until the cold finally forced them to. Foreheads still pressed together, both of them laughing a little, breathless, undone. For the record, Micah murmured against his mouth, "I trusted my patient with far more than my professional judgment ever should have allowed." For the record, Eli said back, smiling for what felt like the first time in years without a single wall behind it, "I'm glad you did." Spring came slowly to Holloway Cove the way it always did, ice giving way to mud and mud giving way, eventually, to green. Warren Rourke showed up at the Wharf restaurant one evening in April, uninvited, and sat himself down at the table where Eli and Micah were having dinner, and though the conversation was awkward and full of long pauses, it was also, unmistakably, an old man trying, clumsily, sincerely, to build a bridge he'd let stand broken for over a decade. He asked Micah, gruffly, whether he knew how to fillet a proper flounder, and when Micah admitted he didn't, Warren said he'd better learn if he intended to keep coming around, and something in the offer, half challenge, half invitation, settled a small, permanent warmth in Eli's chest. By June, Warren had started asking after Micah by name instead of the doctor, which Eli understood, from a man built entirely of Maine granite and 40 years of practiced silence, as something close to a blessing. Micah kept a photograph of Daniel on his desk still, and Eli never once asked him to put it away. Some loves don't need to be erased to make room for new ones. They simply become part of the architecture. A room in the house that stays furnished even as new rooms get built around it. Micah visited Daniel's grave twice that spring, and both times Eli drove him there and waited quietly in the car, understanding without needing to be told that grief and new love could sit at the same table without one crowding out the other. Renzo wrote them both a long, warm letter that April, thanking Eli for whatever he'd done to bring some color back into his brother-in-law's voice, and Micah cried reading it on the porch, and Eli simply sat beside him and let him. There was a night in May when Eli finally asked Micah to move his things properly into the house on Cliffside Road, not as a grand gesture but as a quiet, practical question over dinner. "I've got a whole apartment full of boxes I never bothered to unpack because some part of me never believed I'd stay anywhere long enough to matter. I'd rather unpack them here with you if you'll have me." And Micah had gone very still for a moment before answering, eyes bright, and said only, "I've been waiting for you to ask," and that had been the whole conversation, easy and certain in a way that surprised them both after so many months of careful hesitation. Moving Eli's few boxes and took an entire Saturday, mostly because neither of them could resist stopping every 20 minutes to examine some object from the other's life. A photograph of Eli as a boy on his father's boat, gap-toothed and grinning. A sketch Daniel had once made of Micah asleep on a porch swing, which Micah hung without hesitation in the hallway, telling Eli plainly that he wanted him to know Daniel even now, even like this, as part of the whole shape of the man Eli had fallen. For Eli found he didn't mind at all. If anything, hanging that sketch beside a photograph of his own mother in the same hallway felt like exactly the right architecture for the life they were building. Room enough for every love that had shaped them, old and new standing companionably side by side. Warren Rourke showed up at the Wharf restaurant one evening in April, uninvited, and sat himself down at the table where Eli and Micah were having dinner, and though the conversation was awkward and full of long pauses, it was also, unmistakably, an old man trying, clumsily, sincerely, to build a bridge he'd let stand broken for over a decade. He asked Micah, gruffly, whether he knew how to fillet a proper flounder, and when Micah admitted he didn't, Warren said he'd better learn if he intended to keep coming around, and something in the offer, half challenge, half invitation, settled a small, permanent warmth in Eli's chest. By June, Warren had started asking after Micah by name instead of the doctor, which Eli understood, from a man built entirely of Maine granite and 40 years of practiced silence, as something close to a blessing. He even came by the house on Cliffside Road one Sunday with a cooler of fresh-caught flounder and a stack of paper plates, and stood in the kitchen for 2 clumsy, patient hours teaching Micah exactly how to run a knife along the spine, occasionally correcting Eli's technique too out of old habit, and Eli watched his father and the man he loved laugh together over a ruined fillet and thought his chest might not be able to hold all of what he felt. Micah kept a photograph of Daniel on his desk still, and Eli never once asked him to put it away. Some loves don't need to be erased to make room for new ones. They simply become part of the architecture. A room in the house that stays furnished even as new rooms get built around it. Micah visited Daniel's grave twice that spring, and both times Eli drove him there and waited quietly in the car, understanding without needing to be told that grief and new love could sit at the same table without one crowding out the other. On the second visit, Micah asked him to come stand beside him at the graveside instead of waiting in the car, and Eli did, quiet and steady, and Micah introduced him to the headstone in a voice thick with emotion. "This is Eli. I think you'd have liked him. I think you'd be glad, actually, that I found my way to letting someone else in." And something about hearing his own name spoken so tenderly into that particular grief undid Eli completely, standing there in the wind with his hand resting against the small of Micah's back. Renzo wrote them both a long, warm letter that April, thanking Eli for whatever he'd done to bring some color back into his brother-in-law's voice. And Micah cried reading it on the porch, and Eli simply sat beside him and let him. Callum, of all people, sent a bottle of good scotch when he heard the news through the Boston grapevine, along with a note that read only, "Took you long enough, Bennett." Daniel would be insufferably smug about being right. Micah laughed himself half to tears reading it, and told Eli that Callum's teasing, this time, felt entirely different than it had on the night of the lantern walk. No longer a wound reopened, but an old friend simply glad to see him whole again. The town, in its slow and thorough way, came around too. There were still a few narrowed looks at the diner, a few murmured comments Eli chose not to dignify with his attention. But far more often now there were nods of easy acceptance, Mrs. Aldous topping off both their coffees without comment. The harbor crew ribbing Eli good-naturedly about his doctor's orders whenever he skipped a second helping of pie, the whole unhurried machinery of small-town life simply making room, the way it eventually does, for two men who clearly weren't going anywhere. On a warm evening at the end of June, the two of them walked out to the end of the town dock again, the same walk they'd taken more times than either could count since that cold December night, and Eli found himself thinking, not for the first time but more clearly than ever, that this was what healing actually looked like. Not the absence of scars, but two men choosing, every single day, to keep walking toward each other anyway. "I keep thinking about that title everyone in town gave us," Micah said, laughing, as they stood at the rail watching the boats. "The harbor pilot and the widowed doctor. Sounds like something out of a paperback romance." "I trusted my doctor with my secret," Eli said, grinning, and then he went and shared his. "Best decision either of us ever made," Micah said, and pulled him close, and the lighthouse beam swept over the water one more time, gold light falling gently across two men who had finally, after everything, stopped hiding from the truth of what they'd found in each other. It was, Eli thought, exactly the kind of slow-burn romance he'd never let himself believe he deserved. Not a rescue, not a cure, just two careful hearts finding their way, patiently, honestly, into the same quiet harbor. A year to the night from that first freezing confession on the dock, Eli found himself standing in almost the exact same spot, snow just beginning to dust the boards underfoot, waiting for Micah to finish locking up the clinic and join him. The lighthouse beam swept its familiar arc across the black water, same as it had every night of his life, and Eli thought, not for the first time, how strange it was that a place he'd once associated only with hiding had become the place he most associated with being fully known. Micah found him there a few minutes later, breath clouding in the cold, and slipped an arm around him without a word, the two of them settling into a silence that had long since stopped needing to be filled. "Do you know what today is?" Eli asked eventually. "I have a fairly good guess," Micah said, smiling against the collar of Eli's coat. "I believe it's the anniversary of the night my patient told me he loved me and completely destroyed every careful boundary I'd been clinging to for 2 years. Best decision you ever made," Eli said, echoing him, and felt Micah laugh softly against his shoulder. There was a small box in Eli's coat pocket that he'd been carrying for 3 days, waiting for the right moment, terrified in the particular, hopeful way that only comes from wanting something enormously and refusing to let the wanting be ruined by rushing it. He'd asked Warren's blessing the week before, standing awkwardly in his father's kitchen while the old man fixed him with a long, assessing look before finally saying, gruffly, that it was about time somebody in this family did something brave out loud instead of just feeling it quietly for 12 years. He'd visited his mother's grave again too, and Daniel's, in his own quiet way, needing both of them, He realized, to feel that this next step belonged to the whole architecture of who he was becoming, not just the newest room in it. I have something to ask you, Eli said now, turning to face him fully, heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with any arrhythmia a stethoscope could ever find. And I need you to let me get all the way through it, because if you interrupt me, I don't think I'll finish. Micah went very still, eyes widening slightly as understanding began to dawn, and said only softly, okay. The exact same word he'd said a year ago on this same stretch of dock, when Eli had first found the courage to tell him the truth about himself. A year ago I stood right here and told you the biggest secret I'd carried my whole life, and you didn't just accept it. You met it with one of your own, and instead of that breaking us, it built something I didn't know I was allowed to have. I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what else I might have been brave enough to say if I just kept going. So, Micah Bennett, will you marry me? For a moment Micah didn't answer at all, just stood there with tears freezing faintly at the corners of his eyes. One hand pressed briefly to his mouth, before he closed the distance between them and kissed Eli hard enough to answer the question without a single word needing to be said. When he finally pulled back, breathless, forehead resting against Eli's, he laughed. A wet, joyful, unguarded sound Eli had come to treasure more than almost anything else in the world. Yes, Micah said. Obviously, completely, entirely yes. I've been quietly hoping you'd ask since around March. For the record, so you've made a fairly relieved man out of me tonight. Eli slid the ring onto his hand with fingers that weren't quite steady, laughing through his own tears now, and the lighthouse beams swept over them once more, gold light falling across two men who had spent a lifetime learning, in their own separate ways, how much courage it takes to be truly known, and who had finally, together, found somewhere safe enough to stop hiding for good. They stood there a long while after, not saying much, simply watching the lighthouse do what it had always done. Turning its steady, patient light out over the dark water, guiding home anyone who needed guiding, asking nothing in return. Eli thought about all the versions of himself that had stood on this same stretch of dock over the years. The boy trailing his father down to the boats, the young man carrying a secret too heavy to set down, the grown man who'd nearly convinced himself that being known and being safe could never belong to the same life. He thought about how wrong that last version of himself had turned out to be, and how grateful he was to have been wrong. Ready to go home? Micah asked eventually, still smiling, still a little tearful, his hand warm and certain in Eli's own. Yeah, Eli said, and found that the word had never once, in his whole life, felt so completely uncomplicatedly true. I really am. They walked back up the dock together, the lighthouse beam sweeping steadily behind them, and neither of them looked back, because for the first time in either of their lives, there was nothing left behind them worth looking back for, only the whole unhidden shape of what still lay ahead. If this story moved you, if you felt Eli and Micah's slow burn romance build the same steady, aching warmth it built in me while I wrote it, let me know in the comments whether you'd like to see a part 2, following them further into their life together. And if stories like this heartfelt love story mean something to you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more original LGBTQ romance stories, with new ones released regularly for anyone who still believes in second chance love.